This is a very short video as the beginning of the series that we'll watch for class on Friday. It's going to be a brief intro into the Depression, and we'll pick up with more details in class. So what we're looking at, of course, is what it is that brought the Roaring Twenties to a close, and that is going to be the crash of the stock market, which becomes the visible symbol of the Great Depression that follows the most difficult economic crisis in the history of our country, hopefully ever. So we take a quick look at the election of 1928 because we're going to bring in Herbert Hoover as the President of the United States. The Republicans decided not to renominate Coolidge, but instead decided to turn to Hoover, who had become pretty famous for his work actually with Wilson during World War I, as a man who had helped to revive and help, well, not revive, but help the people of Belgium after their terrible treatment at the hands of the German Imperial Army, and also was very instrumental in helping many of the people who were devastated at the end of World War I. So he had made his name helping others, and yet he's going to be the third of the prototypical Republican presidents of the 1920s. As you look at the electoral map here in 1928, you can see that the Republicans are very much ascendant, holding on to Massachusetts as well as some of the Deep South. You can see that the Republicans are actually eroding the Democratic base even in the Deep South as the economy continues to grow during the 1920s. This map will change dramatically as a result of the Great Depression, and it'll be astounding to see how it changes by the next presidential election, which will be 1932. What we can say about Herbert Hoover is that he will ultimately become the symbol of the Depression, even though it's very difficult to really blame him for the Depression itself. The Depression is caused by many different factors, but the idea that he caused it is rather laughable in many ways, because he's only in office beginning in March. In fact, he takes office March 4th, 1929, and it's October 29th, 1929 that the stock market crashes. And no matter what Hoover had done in that short period of time, it would be hard to believe that he could have done anything that would cause the economy to go from being very, very positive, which it was according to the American voters in 1928, to the Great Depression. So I often equate Hoover and his role in the Great Depression as sort of being like someone who was sent to take over the wheel of the Titanic just before it hit the iceberg. There really wasn't much that he could do about it. Now, as we'll see, he won't do much after the Depression hits, and that actually is what adds to the negative image that he will have. So Hoover takes over, no clue that the economy will crash. What's interesting about the 1928 election is not just that Hoover wins, but also that Al Smith is the candidate for the Democratic Party. He was actually the governor of New York, and he is the first Catholic candidate of a major party. The next one, of course, will be victorious, and that will be John F. Kennedy in 1960. And we've talked about the history of Catholics and Protestants in the United States, so it was quite a change for the Democrats to actually choose a Catholic in 1928. And although he loses, one of the interesting things about that election was that knowing what we know about what happens in the future, you can see the basis of what really becomes the modern Democratic Party coming together with Smith in 1928, but because of the popularity of the Republicans really having no chance to actually win the election. But what you see is the beginning of a voting bloc that historians have called the Roosevelt Coalition, because of course it backs Franklin Roosevelt for 4 elections, and it's really the base of the the Democratic Party even today. These voters tended to be urban, reform-minded, tended to be liberal. It included union members, immigrants, and for the very first time you saw the beginning of black voters in decent numbers switching from voting for the Republican Party, as they had done since they had gained the vote during Reconstruction or at the end of the Civil War, and instead voting for the Democratic Party. Now, the Democrats actually made a conscious effort to convince African American voters, who were getting more numerous in the cities by the year as more immigrants moved from the Deep South, or more migrants from the Deep South up to the northern urban areas. And they did so by actually creating a phrase to kind of describe why the black voters should vote for the Democratic Party. And it was that they should turn Lincoln's picture to the wall and vote for a party that would actually do something for them. The argument the Democrats made to African American voters was the Republican Party, yes, was the party that had ended slavery and was Lincoln's party, but it's time now to vote for somebody who will actually support your concerns. And since the Democrats were the party of the lower classes and of the working class, and most African Americans tended to be at that level, it made more sense that they would help African Americans than the Republican Party, which was still and continues today to be identified more with the upper class and with business. So this coalition becomes very important and continues to be that way today. So we'll see them really have their big impact as we move to 1932. All right, the crash of the stock market, which actually takes place on October 29th, 1929. The crash becomes the visible symbol of the Great Depression that followed. Now we're going to go through the handout, and that's the one that I gave you before we left class. But very briefly, as you hopefully have the handout in front of you, and if you don't, we'll talk about it in class again. But the key to the end of the growth of the economy in the 1920s was that the American public had pretty much purchased everything that it possibly could. And as we'll see, that leads to production being cut, which means that businesses are not growing as much, and so they will cut production. They will then lay off people. As they lay off people, then consumer buying drops, and that actually causes declines in demand even more, which leads to more production cuts, layoffs, consumer buying dropping, and continues in a circle like that. Now this leads to the stock market, because stocks are supposed to be traded at the level of value of the company itself. Now the key is that it is the perceived value, and we will talk all about how the stock market itself was funded and how the growth in the stock market really had ended for the most part, by the end of 1926 and the beginning of 27. That was the growth that was actually based on, or excuse me, the value of the stock had gone up because of actual growth in companies. And that ended about the end of 26 and early 27. But the price of stock had continued to rise because everyone had been convinced that all you had to do was buy stock and you could make immediate profit, and it was almost a guaranteed income. And so since everybody was buying it, even though the actual growth in companies was not increasing, people believed that they could still make more money. And we'll pick up with that and look at how it leads to the crash in class on Friday.